When I saw their lawyer waiting at my door, standing too straight in a suit that didn't quite fit the street, I knew the game had just begun. He held his briefcase like a shield, and the way his eyes flickered over my porch told me everything. He wasn't here by accident, and this wasn't a social call. I remember the day clearly, the kind of California morning that pretends to be gentle. Sun on the railing, the smell of oranges from the neighbor's tree. And still, underneath all that peace, I felt the tremor. It had been coming for months, though I had tried to ignore it, the tone in my son's voice tightening each time he called, the way my daughter-in-law began ending her texts with phrases like, "just concerned," and "for your safety." Concern is a soft word people use when they are about to take something from you. I opened the door anyway because that's what women like me do. We face things, even when we shouldn't have to. "Mrs. Halperin?" he asked, though he knew exactly who I was. I nodded. "I represent your son and daughter-in-law. They've asked me to discuss some arrangements regarding your estate." His smile was professional, not unkind, but careful, too careful, as if I might break or bite. I told him he could wait on the porch. I wasn't dressed for guests. He said he'd wait, but when I came back, he was already looking through the envelope in his hands, like a man trying to find the shortest route to victory. "They're only thinking of your well-being," he said when I returned, his tone soothing, rehearsed. That was when I realized this wasn't about love or protection. It was about ownership. My house, my savings, my quiet. It always starts with concern, then comes efficiency, and finally, the paperwork. I remember how steady my hands were when I took the envelope from him. I didn't tremble, not once. I thanked him, even smiled. I wanted him to see what dignity looks like when it's cornered. He cleared his throat, said something about signatures and dates. I let him talk. People like him mistake silence for weakness, but silence is often the sound of calculation. After he left, I stood there, watching him walk down the path lined with cracked stone tiles I'd laid with my husband 40 years ago. My name was still etched faintly into one of them. The sun hit the gold trim of his car door, and I caught my reflection in the window. Small, silver-haired, but not defeated. That's when the first thought came. Not fear, not confusion, but an old, familiar burn. They had underestimated me. They always did. I sat at the kitchen table, spread out the documents, and read every word, every clause designed to make me invisible. Power of attorney, asset transfer, assisted care authorization. A neat little trap built out of love and legal language. I could almost hear my son's voice in the phrasing, rational, managerial, stripped of warmth. "It's for your protection, Mom. You're getting older. Things happen. Yes, things happen. Things like sons turning into men who think you're a liability. Things like daughters-in-law who smile while they rearrange your life into something they can control." I poured myself a cup of tea, jasmine, the good kind I save for guests, and drank it slowly, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue. I thought about how many times I'd signed things without reading them. School forms, insurance renewals, loan applications when Daniel was in college. I'd trusted too easily, always assuming the person on the other side of the paper had my best interests at heart. Now I knew better. I left the papers spread across the table for hours, letting the afternoon light move across them until the words stopped looking official and started looking personal. That's what betrayal is. It hides in paperwork and polite voices. By evening, I folded everything neatly and placed it in a drawer. I wasn't going to react. I was going to remember. The night was long. I didn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the familiar creak of the floorboards. Every house develops a language over time, and this one spoke to me in sighs. I'd built this place with my own hands, the down payment scraped from decades of double shifts, thrift, and a husband who used to believe that a home was the only true inheritance. After he died, my son insisted I keep it in my name for tax purposes. But when his tone shifted, when he began asking questions about the bills, the maintenance, the long-term plan, I should have seen the prelude. The world doesn't end in explosions. It ends in signatures. The next morning, I called my son. I wanted to hear it from his voice, to see if he'd flinch. He didn't. He was calm, polite, even proud of himself. "Mom, it's not what you think," he said. "We just don't want you to be taken advantage of." Taken advantage of? By whom? By the neighbors who bring me soup? By the mailman who leaves the parcels by the rose bush because he knows I can't bend easily anymore? No, it's them. It's always the ones who start their sentences with care and end them with control. I said I'd think about it. He sounded relieved, almost cheerful. Good, good. That's all we wanted. Then he hung up. No, I love you. Not even take care. Just the satisfied click of someone who thinks the matter is settled. I sat there for a long time, the receiver still in my hand. The window beside me reflected the morning sun, and I could see the faint outline of my face, lined, yes, but alive. I thought of all the times I'd bitten my tongue, stayed quiet to keep peace. But peace, I was starting to realize, is often just silence dressed up nicely. The kettle whistled. I poured another cup and whispered to the empty room. They've started a war they don't know how to fight. When you reach my age, people stop seeing you as dangerous. They think your strength has gone soft, that your memory is fogged, that your heart is only capable of nostalgia. But I've seen decades of human behavior, wars, marriages, recessions, and funerals. People don't change. They just get better at disguising their motives. I looked down at the papers again. My name was there, printed bold, almost as if it were a signature of surrender. But I've never surrendered in my life, not once. Not when I buried my husband, not when I sold the jewelry to pay Daniel's tuition, not when I sat in a hospital corridor for 2 days while my sister slipped away. Strength isn't loud. It's patient. It waits for the right moment to strike. That night, I took a pen and wrote one sentence at the top of the legal page. I do not consent. It wasn't much, just 4 words, but they steadied my hand. I felt something shift inside me, small, firm, irreversible. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. By the time the porch light flickered on outside and the street quieted, I had made a promise to myself. I would not let them take what I had built. Not my home, not my name, not my mind. And if they thought this would be a quiet surrender, they had mistaken me for someone else. I might be 82, but I remember every lie I ever agreed to for the sake of keeping the family together. Not this time. This time, they would have to earn my silence. And I knew, deep in my chest, that silence would cost them more than they could afford. The letter came 2 days after the visit. Thick paper, heavy, embossed with a law firm's name that sounded more like a warning than an institution. Caro, Denton, and Blythe. I'd seen enough envelopes in my life to know the difference between correspondence and conquest. I slid it open with the edge of a butter knife, sitting by the window where the light was cleanest, and unfolded what was inside. The words were as polite as they were poisonous. They requested a formal review of my estate, citing concerns regarding recent lapses in judgment and the need for structured oversight. Lapses in judgment, such a soft phrase for what they meant. They wanted control, not care. They wanted the keys, the accounts, the power to decide what I was allowed to own, to spend, to remember. There was even a form for medical consent, as though my body now belonged to a committee. The tone of the letter was immaculate, the kind that hides its cruelty behind commas. I read it 3 times, then placed it flat on the table, the same table where I'd once helped my son with his algebra, where I'd once kneaded bread for Sunday mornings, when he was still small enough to think I knew everything. The kettle hissed behind me. I let it. The room felt different now, like the air itself had turned brittle. I could almost hear my husband's voice, low and steady, saying, "They'll come for what they think they deserve." And that was exactly what this was, a reckoning dressed up as responsibility. That night, I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps, every car passing by like a warning. I thought about the first time my son had used the word we when he meant I. "We think it's time you downsized, Mom. We think it would be safer if you lived closer to us. We think you shouldn't drive anymore." Always we, never I. I used to find it comforting, that idea of family consensus, but now I saw it for what it was, a unanimous decision made in my absence. Around midnight, I got up and went to the kitchen. I made tea, the same ritual that had steadied me through every kind of loss. The smell of jasmine filled the room, soft and stubborn. I sat there until the first light touched the curtains, and I knew I couldn't just sit anymore. By morning, I was dressed, not neatly, but deliberately. The navy skirt, the cardigan with the loose thread, the shoes I kept by the door for errands that mattered. I tucked the letter into my purse and caught the 9:40 bus downtown. The seat smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, a scent I'd come to associate with perseverance. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I didn't have to. I decided that if they wanted to turn my life into paperwork, then I would learn the language of paper better than they ever could. The bus wound through streets I hadn't visited in years, past old shops turned into condos, past the library where I used to volunteer, past the park where I once pushed my son on a swing so high he laughed like he'd never stop. The city had changed, but the courthouse still stood the same, an ugly concrete building pretending to be noble. I found the legal aid office in the basement level, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like restless thoughts. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and anxiety. I took a number and sat beside a woman younger than my granddaughter, holding a folder so tightly her knuckles were white. When they called my number, I stood slowly, every bone in my body remembering what it felt like to walk into a room where people didn't expect me to speak for myself. The paralegal's name was Zora. She couldn't have been more than 30, with bright eyes and a pen that clicked too often. She asked how she could help, and I told her, not everything, not the years of small humiliations, not the way my son's wife smiled when she used the word dependence, just the facts, the lawyer, the letter, the implication that my life was being quietly taken from me. Zora listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked, "Do you have proof of capacity?" "You mean, am I sane?" I said, and she smiled, embarrassed. "We have to ask. It's part of the protocol." I opened my purse and pulled out the crossword puzzle I'd finished that morning, perfectly filled, no blank spaces. "I think this counts," I said. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that doesn't come from amusement, but from respect. She began explaining terms: revocation, durable power, fiduciary abuse, words that sounded cold until I realized they were shields. By the end of the hour, she'd given me a list of steps, places to call, things to file. She said it calmly, like it was all possible, like it wasn't too late. When I left, I felt lighter and older at the same time. Outside, the air had turned sharp, and I could see my reflection faintly in the courthouse glass. For the first time in months, I looked like someone who was still in possession of herself. The next day, my son called again. His voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Mom, did you get our letter?" I said I had. "Good. It's just formality, to make sure everything's handled properly." I asked him who it was really for. He didn't understand. "The letter," I said. "Was it for me or for you to feel in charge?" There was silence. I could hear him breathing, slow, controlled. "You're overreacting," he said finally. "We're just trying to help." Help. That word again, the polite cousin of control. I told him I'd take care of it myself. "That's not how this works, Mom." But it is, I thought. That's exactly how this works. After we hung up, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. My hair needed cutting. My face had the look of a woman who's waited too long to be taken seriously. But my eyes were clear. The next morning, I went to the bank. I wanted to see with my own eyes what they had touched. The teller looked at me curiously when I asked for a printed statement. "Do you suspect fraud?" she asked. "I suspect family," I said. She didn't laugh. She printed the papers and slid them across the counter. I studied every line until I found it. A transfer of $5,000, labeled household maintenance. I hadn't requested it. I hadn't approved it. That's when the room started to spin, not from shock, but from recognition. They'd started taking from me long before the lawyer came. They were just formalizing the theft now. I went home, placed the bank statement beside the legal letter, and realized I was looking at two versions of the same thing. Love reduced to accounting. That night, I couldn't bring myself to eat. I boiled pasta, let it sit too long, then drained it and threw it away. I sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker, and thought of my mother. She died in a nursing home miles away. Her name spelled wrong on the paperwork. I'd promised myself I would never end like that, trapped behind walls someone else thought were safe. And now, here it was again, history repeating itself in the fine print. Around midnight, I opened a blank notebook and began writing. Names, dates, amounts, details. Not for revenge, not even for defense, but for clarity. Betrayal feels cleaner when you can itemize it. I wrote until the pen ran dry, then sat back and let the silence fill the room. That's when I realized something crucial. They thought they were protecting their inheritance. What they didn't know was that the most valuable thing I still owned was the truth, and I was just beginning to write it down. In the morning, I would go back to the courthouse. I would file what Zora told me to file. I would speak clearly and without trembling, because when you've spent a lifetime being reasonable, your rebellion is believing your own voice again. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope of my own, and wrote one line on the front in my steady, unshaken hand. For the record, I am not finished yet. The morning I went back to the courthouse, the rain had already started, fine and deliberate, the kind of rain that doesn't soak you at once, but seeps through your coat until you realize you're colder than you thought. I carried my folder in a plastic bag to keep it dry, the one with the wrinkled handles that used to hold groceries, before everything in my life began to feel like evidence. The bus was late, the floor sticky, and no one met my eyes. That was fine. I wasn't looking for kindness anymore. I was looking for resolve. I arrived just after 9, walked past the security guard who waved me through without question, and found Zora at her desk, half buried in paperwork. She looked surprised but not displeased to see me. "You came back," she said, and I told her I had work to do. Together we filled out forms. revocation of prior authorization, statement of capacity, a formal complaint for financial coercion. The words looked strange under my name, like I was reading about someone else. But then I saw the signature line, and something inside me straightened. I wrote my full name in careful loops, each letter like a small victory. When we finished, Zora said, "This will take time." I told her I had plenty. I'd been waiting for years, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for gratitude, waiting for my own life to stop being treated like a shared account. Time was no enemy of mine anymore. Outside, the rain had turned to mist. I walked to the cafe across the street and ordered coffee I didn't want, just to have somewhere to sit. The waitress called me Han and left the pot. Around me, people tapped at laptops, muttered into phones, moved on with their days. It was strangely comforting to be invisible among the living. I pulled the folded letter from my purse and looked at the date again. 2 weeks. That was all it had taken for my son to turn me from mother to liability. I wondered if he even knew what he'd done, or if in his mind he was still the good son, the responsible one, saving me from myself. It's funny how people like to narrate their betrayals as kindness. I paid for the coffee, left a tip bigger than I could afford, and walked home slowly. The city felt heavier, as if I were moving through a fog made of paperwork and memory. When I reached my house, there was an unfamiliar car parked across the street. Black, polished, engine idling. My first thought was that it was him, the lawyer, back again. But when I drew closer, I saw it was just a delivery driver eating his lunch. I laughed quietly to myself. Paranoia, I thought. Then I remembered that paranoia is just pattern recognition in a world that prefers denial. Inside, the house was dim. I turned on the lamp in the kitchen, the one with the crack along the base, and laid out my papers. The kettle hissed. Steam rose in soft ribbons. I began sorting. Bank statements, old letters, receipts. I wanted to see everything clearly, to know exactly what they had tried to do. I found the old folder from the year I sold the house after my husband died. There it was, in black and white. My name, my signature, my decisions. No one had guided my hand then. No one had suggested I wasn't capable. I traced the ink with my fingertip, the faint groove pressed into the paper. My husband's handwriting was beside it, his witness signature small and steady. "Never let them decide for you," he used to say. He meant politicians, corporations, anyone with a clipboard. I never thought the warning would apply to our own son. Around noon, the phone rang. It was my daughter-in-law, her voice sweetened with effort. "Hi, Mom, just checking in. Daniel said you've been busy lately." I told her I had. "Busy with what?" she asked too casually. "Paperwork," I said. Silence followed, the kind that hums with calculation. "Oh, that," she said finally. "You really don't need to stress yourself. We're just trying to streamline things. You know how complicated estates can get." I said I was learning. She laughed lightly, that high, brittle laugh that sounds like a glass being set down too hard. "You're so independent," she said, as if it were a flaw. "We just want to help." I thanked her for the concern and hung up. The quiet afterward was thick. I sat back and stared at the phone, remembering the first time I met her. She'd been all charm and polish, the kind of woman who made compliments sound like small tests. "You must be so proud," she'd said when Daniel proposed. I had been. Now I wasn't sure what pride was worth when it came at the cost of erasure. By evening, I had made a list of everything I needed to protect. Accounts, identification, the deed to the house, the savings bond I'd never mentioned to anyone. I placed them in separate envelopes and hid them in places that only memory could map. The hollow behind the loose kitchen tile, the old teapot no one used, the folded blanket at the back of the linen closet. It wasn't fear driving me anymore. It was precision. I was reclaiming territory one secret at a time. Over the next few days, the phone calls multiplied. Daniel left messages, each one shorter than the last, the concern draining away and being replaced by irritation. Mom, we need to settle this before it gets messy. Mom, you're being unreasonable. Mom, you're making things harder than they have to be. I didn't return any of them. Instead, I learned how to speak their language. I visited the bank again, set up alerts, moved the remaining balance into a private account. I filed a fraud report under Zora's advice. I changed the lock on my mailbox. Each act was small but cumulative, like laying bricks in a wall no one could see yet. One afternoon, I came home to find a note slipped under my door. No envelope, just Daniel's handwriting. We're worried. Call us. The we again, that false chorus. I burned it in the sink. The ash curled in on itself and drifted like feathers. That night, I dreamed of my husband. He was sitting at the kitchen table, reading the newspaper, sunlight catching the edge of his glasses. You were always the cautious one, he said. Now look at you. I wanted to answer, to tell him that caution and rebellion are sisters, but the dream dissolved before I could. I woke to the smell of rain and the realization that I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry, but in the clean way anger feels when it's finally earned. The next day, I went to see Zora again. She was waiting with a small smile. We got the temporary injunction, she said. They can't act on any of the documents until the review. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was space to breathe. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? She asked. I told her I did, though it wasn't entirely true. Safety is a myth for women my age. We build it in our heads and hope it lasts. I walked home slowly, past shop windows reflecting my image. Small, stooped, but upright. I passed a florist and stopped. There were yellow tulips in a bucket outside. My husband used to buy them for me every spring, saying they looked like small suns. I bought a bunch, carried them home, and placed them on the table next to the legal documents. Life and defense side by side. I made soup that night, the kind with lentils and cumin, the smell filling every corner of the house. For a moment, I almost felt peace. Then the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Daniel. It was a man's voice, official, controlled. Mrs. Halperin, this is Richard Holt from Caro, Denton and Blythe. I understand you filed a counteraction. We'd like to resolve this amicably. I asked him if amicable meant surrender. He chuckled softly, the way men do when they think they're dealing with someone fragile. It means we all want what's best for you. I told him I already had what was best for me, autonomy. He didn't respond. After a pause, he said, Your son is hurt by all this. I said, So am I. He sighed, muttered something about families and misunderstandings, and hung up. I poured the soup into a bowl and sat alone at the table, the steam rising like ghosts. I ate slowly, every bite deliberate. Betrayal doesn't always taste bitter. Sometimes it's just warm and sad. After dinner, I wrote in my notebook again. I listed not what they had done, but what I had left, skills, instincts, small defiances. Underneath, I wrote a single sentence. They think they are winning. Then, after a pause, but they've taught me how to fight in silence. The days that followed blurred together, a rhythm of errands, paperwork, quiet victories. I felt my strength returning in strange ways. My hands, once hesitant, moved with certainty again. My voice, when I practiced it aloud, no longer wavered. Even the house seemed to breathe differently, as if relieved that someone was defending it. On the 5th day, I walked to the mailbox and found a small card. No return address, just 3 words typed neatly. We will persist. I laughed so hard I startled the neighbor's cat. Let them. Persistence is only frightening to those who have something to lose. I had already lost their love. What remained was mine alone. That night, I turned off all the lights, opened the window, and listened to the rain. It wasn't gentle anymore. It was steady, relentless, honest. It sounded exactly like justice beginning to arrive. The shift began not with some grand revelation, but with a phone call I didn't expect. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, the air outside heavy with the smell of wet earth after rain. I had just come back from the courthouse where I dropped off another form, the kind that promised nothing but required everything: patience, precision, endurance. When the phone rang, I almost didn't answer. I'd learned that silence could be a form of self-defense, but something about the rhythm of the rings, steady and unhurried, made me pick it up. The voice on the other end was young, female, uncertain. Mrs. Halperin, this is Zora from the Legal Aid Office. I just wanted to let you know I found someone who might be able to help you beyond paperwork. She runs a small community program for seniors, financial literacy, self-advocacy, that kind of thing. Her name's Marta. I thanked her, not because I believed in miracles, but because belief itself was a kind of rebellion. She gave me an address, a community center near the river, and said, "She's expecting you Thursday. Don't worry, she's kind." I wrote it down in careful block letters and stuck the note under a magnet on the refrigerator next to a grocery list that had been sitting there untouched for weeks. For the next 2 days, I kept thinking about that word, kind. It's one of those words that's been devalued by overuse. People call you kind when they mean compliant, kind when they mean harmless, kind when they mean easy to forget. I wasn't sure I wanted to be kind anymore. But Thursday came, as it always does, and I went. The bus route was long and winding, past parts of the city I hadn't seen in years. The community center was a squat brick building with faded murals of children and trees, a place that smelled faintly of floor wax and hope. Inside, a woman sat behind a folding table stacked with brochures. She was small, wiry, maybe in her 60s, with eyes that seemed to see right through pretenses. "You must be Martha," she said. "Zora told me you're a fighter." I laughed quietly. "I didn't know I'd signed up for boxing lessons." "Oh, you did," she said, smiling. "They just don't call it that." She led me to a room lined with mismatched chairs and a bulletin board covered with flyers, support groups, housing advice, free tax help. A few other women sat scattered around, each one holding some version of a folder or envelope, each one wearing the look of someone who had been told she was no longer the main character in her own life. Marta began to speak. She didn't start with legal jargon or pity. She talked about survival, about how systems are designed to confuse you into surrender. She said, "They win when you believe you're the problem." I felt something unclench inside me, something that had been tight for years. After the meeting, she came up to me and asked how long I'd been dealing with my situation. "Too long," I said. "Then you're right on time," she replied. She gave me a booklet about elder rights, but it was her tone more than the pages that stayed with me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like a case file. I felt seen. On my way home, I stopped at a small diner. It was almost empty, except for a man reading a newspaper at the counter. The waitress poured me coffee without asking, and I realized how starved I'd been for small gestures that didn't come with an agenda. I sat there for a long time, sipping slowly, thinking of what Marta had said. They win when you believe you're the problem. My son had been telling me for years that I was forgetful, that I didn't understand modern finances, that I was lucky to have him manage things. I used to accept it as fact, even joke about it. What would I do without you? I'd say. I never realized how dangerous that question was. It had turned from affection into dependency without me noticing. That night, I pulled out every document I'd ever signed with his name on it. I read them all, line by line. I made notes in the margins, circled dates, highlighted clauses. I was still at it when the sky began to pale. The house smelled of stale coffee and ink. It was the smell of reclaiming something. In the morning, I took a walk, something I hadn't done in weeks. The world outside felt oddly new. I noticed how the air moved through the trees, how the light changed the color of the pavement. When you've been living in fear, noticing beauty feels like defiance. I stopped by the corner store and bought a notebook, the thick kind with a sturdy spine, and began writing everything down. Each interaction, each phone call, each moment of doubt. It wasn't paranoia, it was documentation. I was building a record of my own voice. A few days later, Zora called again to tell me that the court date was set. 2 months away. That's time to prepare, she said. You're doing everything right. Her confidence steadied me more than she could have known. I thanked her and hung up. For the first time in years, I didn't dread the calendar. I marked the date in red and drew a small circle around it, not as a warning, but as a promise. That week, I started rearranging my house. It sounds trivial, but it felt like rewriting my own story. I took down the framed family photos from the hallway, the ones where I was smiling but not seen, and replaced them with old landscapes I'd painted in my 30s, back when I still believed in quiet hobbies. I found my husband's old hammer and fixed the loose hinge on the cabinet myself. I scrubbed the kitchen floor until it gleamed, not because I was cleaning for anyone, but because I wanted to live somewhere that reflected care, not chaos. I even bought a new lamp, something small and bright that made the evenings softer. It was in those quiet nights that the real shift happened. I began to imagine a future that didn't depend on permission. The fear was still there, like an old scar aching before rain, but it no longer ruled me. My son called less frequently now, perhaps sensing that his grip was slipping. When he did call, the tone was different, sharper, impatient, laced with disbelief. "Mom, I heard you've been talking to lawyers again," he said once. "You don't need to do that." "Apparently, I do," I replied. He sighed, that heavy, condescending sound men use when they think they're being reasonable. "You're letting people fill your head with nonsense." "No," I said. "I'm just listening to my own thoughts for the first time in a long while." He hung up without another word. I sat there for a moment, phone still in hand, feeling neither guilty nor relieved, just awake. In the following days, I began volunteering at the community center. Marta had asked me to help with intake forms, since you're getting good at paperwork. I laughed but agreed. Being there felt like stepping out of a narrow hallway into a wider room. I met women who'd been through worse: evictions, guardianship battles, lost pensions. Their stories were different, but the pattern was the same. People who had once been trusted being told they no longer knew what was best for themselves. I started to realize how ordinary my story was, and that ordinariness was both tragic and empowering. If injustice is ordinary, so can resistance be. I began sleeping better. My dreams shifted from panic to memory, good memories this time. I saw my husband again, not warning me but smiling, saying, "I told you, you'd find your footing." Sometimes I woke up laughing, the sound strange but welcome in my quiet house. One evening, after a long day at the center, I came home to find a letter in the mailbox. No lawyer's stamp, no official tone. Just my granddaughter's handwriting, round, uneven, hopeful. She wrote that her father was worried, that he said I'd become distant, that everyone just wanted things to go back to normal. But then she added a line that changed everything. "I don't know what's true anymore, Grandma, but I hope you're doing what makes you feel free." I read it 3 times and tucked it into my notebook. That one sentence felt like sunlight breaking through a heavy curtain. Freedom isn't always escape. Sometimes it's simply refusing to return. That night, I made myself real dinner for the first time in months. Roast chicken, potatoes, salad with too much vinegar. I ate slowly, with music playing low in the background, and realized I wasn't lonely. Solitude and loneliness are different creatures. Loneliness is the absence of someone else. Solitude is the presence of yourself. And that, finally, was the midpoint. The quiet turn where survival began to resemble living. It began with a knock that was too polite to be innocent. The kind of knock that carries intent behind every tap, rhythm measured, rehearsed, deliberate. I was standing by the sink, washing a plate, when I heard it. The afternoon light had already begun to thin, slanting across the kitchen tiles like pale water, and for a second I thought maybe it was Marta, or the woman from next door bringing back the tin I'd lent her after the bake sale. But when I looked through the small window above the sink, I saw a car parked neatly at the curb, silver, spotless, expensive, and beside it, a man in a charcoal suit holding a slim briefcase and an expression of courteous inevitability. I didn't have to ask who he was. The law has a way of dressing itself the same in every generation. Smooth shoes, thin smiles, voices that sound like verdicts even before the words begin. I dried my hands on a dish towel, walked to the door, and opened it halfway. Enough for civility, but not enough for entry. "Mrs. Halperin?" he asked, and I could hear the precision in his tone, the faint trace of practiced empathy. I nodded. "I'm Mr. Sloan, representing your son Daniel. He's asked me to deliver some documents for your review." His words were clean, as though dust wouldn't dare settle on them. I told him to leave the envelope in the mailbox. He said he was required to hand it to me directly. "Formality," he added, with a small apologetic shrug. That word again, formality, the polite mask of force. I reached for the envelope, careful not to let our fingers touch, and then closed the door before he could speak another word. Through the frosted glass, I saw his outline linger for a moment before turning away. The sound of his shoes on the path faded, but the silence he left behind was heavier than before. I carried the envelope to the kitchen table, the same table where every stage of this quiet war had played out, and sat down. I didn't open it right away. I poured tea first, strong and dark, the kind that can hold its own against dread. Only then did I slide a letter opener through the seal. Inside was a neatly typed statement of intent, petition for conservatorship, request for medical evaluation, and a note from Daniel himself, written in the careful hand of a man who had convinced himself that cruelty was duty. "Mom," it began, "we all know you've been under a lot of stress. You've become suspicious, and it's affecting your health and our relationship. We just want to make sure you're protected." Protected. It's such a beautiful word when spoken by someone who intends to cage you. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to memorize the language of betrayal. Every word was deliberate, crafted to sound loving, designed to sound sane. We're only trying to help. You'll thank us later. Everyone agrees it's for the best. The plural again, the invisible chorus. I folded the letter neatly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it beside my teacup. For a long time, I didn't move. The clock ticked softly behind me, the sound almost kind, like the patient breathing of an old companion. I realized with a strange sort of clarity that this wasn't the beginning of the end. It was the end of pretending. I went to the small cabinet near the hallway, took out my notebook, and began to write. Not about anger or fear, but about preparation. The first thing I did was call Zora. She didn't pick up, so I left a message. It's happening, I said simply. They've escalated. When she called back an hour later, her voice was calm but firm. We can contest this, she said, but they'll try to move fast. They'll frame it as concern. They'll use your age as a weapon. I told her I was ready. No one's ever ready, she replied softly. But you're closer than most. That night, I slept with the envelope on the nightstand, as though keeping the threat close could somehow make it smaller. I dreamt of my son as a boy, sitting at the kitchen table, coloring inside the lines with such concentration that his tongue stuck out. He used to say he wanted to be a builder, someone who made things that lasted. I woke with the taste of that memory in my mouth, bittersweet as burnt sugar. In the morning, I dressed with care, a navy skirt, a pressed blouse, the coat I'd worn to my husband's funeral years ago. I wanted armor, not comfort. At the courthouse, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and resignation. Zora met me at the entrance, carrying a stack of papers and 2 pens. They filed yesterday, she said. We have 10 days to respond. She led me to a small conference room where the walls were the color of neglect. They're claiming diminished capacity, she continued. They've attached statements. Your son, your daughter-in-law, even a doctor. A doctor? I asked. Apparently, they've been consulting someone, she said, scanning the page. A geriatric specialist. He's never met you, but he signed off based on their report. I almost laughed. Imagine being diagnosed through gossip. What happens now? I asked. Now we make noise, she said. Loud, clear, documented noise. For the next hour, we drafted affidavits, letters, formal objections. Each word felt like a stone being set into a foundation I didn't know I was capable of building. When it was done, Zora said, They'll try to scare you. Don't let them. Fear is their currency. I nodded, though fear had already begun to settle in my bones like an old tenant. That afternoon, as I walked home, I saw Daniel's car parked near the curb. He stepped out before I reached the gate. Mom, he said, his voice low, coaxing, like he was talking to a frightened child. Why are you doing this? Doing what? I asked. Making it difficult, he said. You don't have to fight us. You mean surrender quietly? I replied. He sighed, ran a hand through his hair. It's not like that. We're just worried. You've been talking to strangers. You've been secretive. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said. You just don't like what I'm thinking about. He looked genuinely pained for a moment, and I almost faltered. Almost. Then his tone hardened. If this goes to court, it'll get ugly. You'll regret it. I smiled, small and steady. I've lived through worse. He didn't respond. He turned and walked back to his car, the sound of the door slamming echoing longer than it should have. When he drove away, I stood there for a long time, feeling the strange mix of sorrow and relief that comes when love reveals itself as something smaller than you believed. Over the next week, the letters kept coming. Notifications, summonses, requests for evaluation. I kept each one filed, labeled, annotated. I wanted a record of their faithlessness. I met with Marta again at the community center. She listened quietly, her hands folded. "You know," she said after a pause, "most people break by now. They either give in or disappear." "And what happens to the ones who don't?" I asked. "They become very difficult to erase," she said. It was meant as comfort, and it was. The next day, I went to see my doctor, my real doctor, not the ghost they'd conjured in their paperwork. I told him what was happening, showed him the letter, the filings, the accusation. He frowned deeply. "This is absurd," he said. "You're sharp as a tack." He typed something into his computer, printed a statement of full mental capacity, signed and stamped it with a firm hand. I walked out of that office holding the paper like a shield. When I returned home, there was another surprise waiting. My granddaughter had sent a letter again, this one longer, the handwriting neater, more deliberate. "Dad says you're being manipulated," she wrote, "but I don't believe him. You always told me to ask questions when something doesn't feel right. So here's my question. Do you need me?" I read that line over and over until the words blurred. I wanted to protect her from all of this, but I also wanted her to see the truth. So I wrote back. I told her I was fine, stronger than I'd been in years, and that she shouldn't worry. But I ended the letter with a sentence I hadn't planned to write. "Don't let anyone translate your life for you." It felt like a message across generations, a warning, a promise. Days passed. The case advanced. Zora called often, her voice carrying both exhaustion and faith. "We're gaining ground," she said once. "The judge is skeptical of their claim." But she also warned me that they might try another route, pressure through social reputation. And she was right. One morning, I opened the local paper, and there it was. A small article in the community section, "Family Concerned for Elderly Mother's Well-Being." My name wasn't mentioned, but the details were unmistakable. The tone was soft, sympathetic, manipulative. "Sources say the family fears for her safety." I laughed out loud, the sound strange in my empty kitchen. They were building a narrative where I was a fragile ghost, a woman slipping quietly into confusion. I tore the article out and pinned it above my desk, a reminder of what happens when the powerful start to panic. That afternoon, I went for a walk. The sky was heavy, the wind sharp. At the park, I sat on a bench and watched the children play, their laughter wild and thoughtless. A little boy dropped his ball near my feet, and I picked it up, handed it back. His mother smiled at me, a brief, kind gesture. I realized how much of my life had been spent in the background of other people's stories, silent, convenient, invisible. Never again. When I got home, I wrote my will, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to reclaim the narrative. I left small things to the few people who had shown me genuine care, the neighbor who brought soup, Marta, even Zora. For my family, I left words instead of property. "You tried to own me," I wrote, and in doing so, lost me. When I finished, I folded the pages neatly and placed them in an envelope. For the first time in months, I felt light. But the calm didn't last long. 2 days later, another car appeared outside. Different man, different suit, same expression. This one didn't knock. He waited until I stepped outside for the mail, then approached. "Mrs. Halperin," he said, "the hearing's been expedited." I nodded. Of course it has. He hesitated, perhaps expecting anger or confusion. Instead, I said, "Tell Daniel I'll see him there." He blinked, caught off guard, then nodded and left. That night, I didn't sleep, not from fear, but anticipation. The house felt alive again, the creaks and hums no longer lonely but alert. I sat by the window, looking at the faint reflection of my own face. The years had softened me, yes, but they hadn't erased me. I thought of everything I'd endured, loss, labor, invisibility, and realized that survival had always been my inheritance. They had their signatures and summonses, but I had time, memory, and the unwavering certainty that truth, once spoken aloud, can't be retracted. The night deepened, the world quieted, and I whispered to the glass, "Let it come." The courthouse smelled of rain and metal, and too many people trying to pretend they were calm. The floor shone like a mirror that had given up on reflection, and the air conditioning hummed in a tone that seemed designed to flatten every human feeling into bureaucratic composure. I arrived early, because I've always believed that time itself can be a kind of armor. Zora was already there, standing by the elevators, a folder pressed against her chest. She looked tired but steady, her expression sharpened by conviction. "Are you ready?" she asked. "I've been ready since they sent that lawyer to my door," I said, and she smiled just a little, the way people do when they recognize courage disguised as fatigue. The hearing room was smaller than I imagined, less dramatic, more like a waiting room that had been given authority. At the front sat the judge, a woman with silver hair pulled tight and glasses that magnified nothing but her skepticism. She looked at me first, directly, not unkindly, but with the weary neutrality of someone who has seen too many families destroy themselves politely. My son sat to my left with his wife beside him, their lawyer between them like a wall of civility. Daniel looked thinner, older, the lines around his mouth set in an expression of duty he probably thought noble. When he met my eyes, I saw not malice, but pity, and that pity burned hotter than anger ever could. I sat straight, placed my hands on the table, and waited. The proceedings began with introductions, affidavits, summaries of intent. The lawyer spoke first, his tone calm, rehearsed, like a man reciting a sermon he no longer believed in. My clients wish only to ensure their mother's well-being. They've observed concerning patterns, financial mismanagement, paranoia, withdrawal from family interaction. Every phrase was a trap lined with velvet. I didn't interrupt. Zora had told me to let him build the illusion so that the truth could dismantle it piece by piece. When he finished, the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Halperin," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Do you wish to respond?" I stood. The room shifted slightly, or maybe it was just my heartbeat echoing in my ears. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice surprised me. It wasn't frail, wasn't uncertain. It carried the tone of someone who had been silent too long and had decided at last to sound like herself. "My son believes that because I am old, I am unfit. He confuses independence with instability. He confuses his comfort with my safety. He's not wrong that I've changed. I have. But that's not illness. That's awareness." I could feel their eyes on me, Daniel's, his wife's, the lawyer's, watching for weakness, for trembling. There was none. They came to me with lawyers and forms, not love. They used words like concern and protection, but what they meant was control. If I were wealthy enough, they'd call me shrewd. If I were younger, they'd call me independent. But because I'm old, they call me confused. The math doesn't work anymore, Your Honor. It's not my mind that's failing. It's their memory of who raised them. A murmur passed through the room, soft as wind in paper. The judge leaned forward slightly, her pen motionless above the pad. Zora handed her a folder. "These are my client's medical evaluations," she said, her tone clean and measured. "Signed by 2 physicians, both confirming her full mental capacity. There's also evidence of unauthorized withdrawals from her accounts, all linked to her son's access." The lawyer objected, muttered something about context and family arrangements, but the judge silenced him with a glance. She read the papers slowly, lips moving slightly, the sound of each turn of the page louder than breathing. When she looked up, the air seemed to tighten. "Mr. Halperin," she said, "did you authorize these transactions?" Daniel straightened. "It was all discussed with my mother," he said. "We acted in her best interest." I turned toward him. "No," I said, not loud, but final. "You acted in your own." He flinched, and in that small motion, I saw the boy he used to be, the one who would hide behind the sofa when he'd broken something, rehearsing his excuses before I even asked. The judge nodded slowly. "We'll come back to that," she said. "For now, I'd like to hear from Mrs. Halperin's witness." Zora gestured, and the door opened. Marta stepped in, her small frame wrapped in a shawl, eyes steady as ever. She introduced herself as director of the Community Advocacy Center, spoke clearly about the meetings, about the documentation, about how many women had come to her with stories that began exactly like mine. "This is not confusion," she said. "It's coercion." The word hung in the air, heavier than law. When she finished, the room was silent. The judge exhaled slowly. "I've heard enough," she said. "We'll recess for a moment." She left the bench, and the silence that followed felt almost sacred. I turned toward my son. He was staring at the table, his hands clenched. His wife whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. I wanted to reach for him, to touch his face, to ask him when fear had replaced affection, but the years between us had hardened into something unbridgeable. When the judge returned, the decision was brief but absolute. The petition was denied. All prior authorizations nullified, access revoked. The words were plain, administrative, but they landed like a benediction. I felt the tremor of release ripple through my body, not joy exactly, but something quieter and stronger, vindication. Zora squeezed my hand under the table, her gesture small but grounding. Daniel didn't move. His wife's lips tightened, her gaze already shifting toward damage control. The lawyer gathered his papers, murmured something about appeals, but his voice had lost its smoothness. The judge looked at me one last time. "Mrs. Halperin," she said, "I hope you have someone you trust to help you manage these matters going forward." "I do," I said. "Myself." For a moment she smiled. It was the kind of smile people give when they recognize endurance. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse into the gray afternoon. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled of it. Wet pavement, metal, the faint sweetness of relief. Zora walked beside me in silence until we reached the corner. "You did it," she said quietly. "You did it without ever raising your voice." "Sometimes that's the loudest way," I replied. We parted there. I didn't go straight home. Instead, I walked to the river, the one that runs behind the community center, slow and brown and patient. I stood there watching the current, the way it carried debris and light together, without judgment. I thought about everything that had happened, all the words, all the signatures, all the small humiliations that had built up to this single steady moment. Justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't look like triumph. It looks like calm. The city hummed behind me, indifferent and alive. I took off my gloves, felt the cool air against my skin, and realized that my hands weren't shaking anymore. For months they had trembled, out of fear, out of rage, out of exhaustion. But now they were still, completely still. I thought of my husband, of my mother, of every woman I'd ever known who had been told she was too old, too soft, too dependent to stand her ground. I wanted to tell them it was possible, that silence can be broken without shouting, that power can return quietly, like blood to a limb that's been asleep too long. I stayed by the river until the light began to fade. A heron moved across the surface, gray on gray, graceful and unhurried. I felt something inside me mirror its stillness. Then I turned and walked home. The streetlights came on one by one, glowing like small promises in the dark. When I reached my house, the porch light was on. I hadn't left it that way. For a second, I froze, but then I saw who it was. My granddaughter, sitting on the steps, her backpack beside her, her face lit by the soft circle of yellow light. She stood when she saw me. "Grandma," she said, and her voice broke a little. "Dad told me what happened." "Did he?" I asked. She nodded. "He said you embarrassed him." I smiled faintly. "Good. It's about time." She hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged me. I hadn't been held like that in years, not out of duty or politeness, but recognition. "I knew they were wrong," she whispered. "I knew you weren't crazy." I held her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, that mix of shampoo and youth and everything I'd fought to protect. "No," I said softly. "Just awake." We went inside and she made tea, awkward and careful, measuring the sugar the way I used to teach her. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had witnessed every stage of this battle, and for the first time, it felt like a place of peace again. I told her a little about the hearing, not all of it, just enough for her to understand that truth isn't something that appears, it's something you defend. She listened, eyes wide, and when I finished, she said, "You're not afraid anymore, are you?" I shook my head. Fear is a luxury for people who still need permission. She smiled at that, though I could see the sadness in it too, the understanding that something irreversible had happened between her father and me. But she didn't press. We sat there in silence, 2 generations separated by years, but joined by clarity. When she left later that night, she hugged me again, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, that something in this world had turned toward healing. After she was gone, I washed the cups, dried them, and placed them upside down on the rack. The house was quiet, but it was no longer lonely. Outside, the rain began again, soft, rhythmic, cleansing. I went to the window, opened it just a little, and let the cool air move through the room. The papers were still on the table, the court orders, the evidence, the proof that I had survived. I didn't need to look at them anymore. They were no longer symbols of battle, but relics of something finished. I turned off the light, stood there in the dark, and whispered into the silence, not as a prayer, but as a statement of fact. I am still mine. The days after the hearing unfolded with an unfamiliar quiet, the kind that feels neither empty nor heavy, but simply earned. The world outside had already moved on, the newspapers filled with other families, other conflicts, but inside my small house, the air seemed to have a new texture, something lighter, as if the walls themselves were finally exhaling after holding their breath for too long. I woke each morning without the weight of expectation, no phone calls demanding explanations, no envelopes waiting like small traps in the mailbox, no footsteps I didn't trust echoing on the path outside. There was only the hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of the curtain, the slow, unhurried rhythm of my own living. For the first time in years, I had no one's story to protect but my own. At first, I didn't know what to do with the silence. My whole life had been defined by noise, voices giving instructions, voices seeking comfort, voices explaining why everything would be fine, while quietly rearranging my life without permission. Now there was just stillness, and it frightened me for an hour, maybe two, before it began to feel like freedom. I started tending to the garden again, the one that had been half forgotten, left to weeds and the occasional mercy of rain. My knees protested when I knelt, my back complained when I bent, but there was a certain holiness in that small labor, the kind that demands nothing but presence. I trimmed the roses, cleared the dry leaves, and found that beneath the neglect, life had been waiting all along, patient and unresentful. One afternoon, while I was pruning a branch that had grown wild against the fence, I found a small nest, empty but intact, woven with threads of grass and a single blue ribbon that must have come loose from someone's gift long ago. I held it in my hand and thought how fragile things survive, not because they are strong, but because they adapt quietly when the storm forgets them. I brought it inside and placed it on the windowsill beside my teapot, a reminder that endurance can be both delicate and deliberate. My granddaughter visited often after that. She came without warning, always bringing something small, a loaf of bread, a book she thought I'd like, sometimes just her company. She didn't ask about her father much, and I didn't offer stories. There are truths that don't need to be retold to exist. Once, she asked me whether I forgave him. I told her forgiveness is not a key, it's a door that only opens when you stop knocking. I don't hate him, I said. Hatred is a tether, and I've spent too much of my life being tied to other people's definitions of me. She nodded, not as a child agreeing, but as a woman understanding. Sometimes she would help me cook, awkwardly chopping vegetables or stirring soup too fast, spilling more than she saved. And I would watch her hands, so young and impatient, and remember my own, once just as eager, once believing that care was the same thing as control. We would eat quietly, our conversation easy, and in those moments, I felt something close to peace. Not the sentimental kind you read about, but the grounded peace that comes after survival, when you realize no one can ever again mistake your silence for surrender. Daniel never came to see me again. Once I received a short letter from him, typed, unsigned, a single paragraph of apology, written in the language of someone who didn't know how to confess but needed to close a ledger. He said he was sorry for the misunderstanding, sorry things had gone so far, sorry for any pain caused, not sorry for the act itself, only for its consequences. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in a drawer. Some things don't need to be forgiven or forgotten. They just need to be filed under what no longer matters. The next morning, I took my old coat from the closet, the same one I'd worn to the hearing, and went for a walk to the market. The wind was sharp but not cruel, and the city felt less hostile than before, not because it had changed, but because I had. People brushed past, unaware of what had been fought and won in small, quiet rooms with dull fluorescent lights. That's the thing about victory. It rarely looks the way you imagine. It isn't a crowd cheering or a trumpet sounding. It's the moment you realize that your life once again belongs entirely to you, that no one's opinion or pity or paperwork has any claim on your breathing. I bought a single jasmine plant from the florist's stall, its white buds trembling slightly in the breeze. It'll bloom soon, the woman said. They always do, even when you forget to water them. I smiled and thought, yes, they do. When I got home, I placed the plant beside the nest on the windowsill, the two fragile things side by side, one a memory, one a beginning. The afternoon light fell over them softly, and I sat in my chair, letting the sun warm the back of my hands. I realized then that survival had given me something rarer than happiness: clarity. I understood now that growing old isn't the same as being diminished. It's the slow, relentless unveiling of what was always there: your core, your edges, your truth. People talk about age as loss, but it's also distillation. Everything unnecessary falls away until only the essential remains. That night, as I wrote in my notebook for the last time, I didn't list grievances or accounts or evidence. I wrote a letter, not to Daniel or his wife, but to my granddaughter. I told her that strength is not the same as hardness, that love without respect is a chain, and that silence can either destroy you or save you depending on who owns it. I told her that the world will try to translate her worth into something measurable: beauty, youth, obedience, but that the real value lies in how fiercely she defends her right to her own voice. I ended the letter simply: when they come for your peace, remember that it was never theirs to give. I placed it in the same drawer where I'd kept the court documents and Daniel's apology, sealed and addressed, not for now, but for when she would need it. Outside, the night deepened, and the rain began again, light at first, then steady, tapping against the window like a quiet heartbeat. I sat there watching it, the house warm, the air scented faintly with jasmine. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. I had already arrived. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to think not of what was lost, but of what was reclaimed, the simple, unglamorous right to live on my own terms, to be seen not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that a woman's endurance, once awakened, can outlast even her own pain.